So the main thing that is required, the only thing that's required, is for there to be an authentic calling to awakening. And once that calling is there, the main thing is just to follow the calling. There are so many different paths to awakening, and there are non-paths to awakening as well. You know, sometimes it just kind of happens, and there isn't an outward or noticeable process. And so for every ego in the cosmos, there is a different path to that ego dropping away and divinity or awake consciousness emerging within the form of that being. So that's the main thing is, you know, if there's an authentic calling, just, you know, allow that to pull you in the direction that seems like it resonates for you. And it won't necessarily be a straight line. You know, you might wind up going to a false guru, or maybe even a good guru, but who just isn't really good for you. But that too is part of the process. That's part of what the ego needs to go through in order to run out of gas and to finally just kind of, you know, fall away. So that's sort of the general principle. Now there are, you know, certain practices that seem to help, you know, and, you know, one or more of them might resonate for you. And if they do, then, you know, check them out. And if they don't, then, you know, just kind of put it in the memory bank somewhere, and it might show up again later as something that's helpful or not, you know, but it's information for you to have and to see what resonates for you. So the first one is, you know, what we see happening all the time, which is meditation. You go to a Buddhist monastery, they're meditating a lot. And in particular, Zen meditation is just very regimented and very still. And the idea there is to still the mind, is to get the mind to quiet down and to stop you know, bouncing around and going swirling in circles and thinking about all the, you know, different dramas and stories and conflicts and the thing that you have to do, you know, for dinner that night, and, you know, your to-do list and things like that. And, you know, the typical human mind is very busy. And as long as it's moving, it is sort of reflecting, the ego is reflecting itself back to itself. Every movement becomes like a mirror where it sees itself within that thought. It sees itself within the story behind the thought and behind the reaction that that thought provokes. And so that's how the ego keeps itself alive, is by constantly creating this reflection in the mind. And so if you meditate and you drop out of that and just allow the mind to be very still, then that self-reflection process that the ego is doing starts to lose steam. And as it loses steam and it gets more quiet, then presence can start to emerge. And as there's more presence, it becomes harder for the ego to keep moving and creating its own reflection for itself. And with enough of that stillness, there will be eventually enough that the ego can't move anymore. The ego goes into stillness, and then it pops, it just drops away. So that is one of the most well-known paths to awakening, is to create stillness in the mind so that the ego has nowhere to go and it stops seeing itself reflected in consciousness. And then truth emerges. Your true nature emerges because the falseness is no longer validating itself through a very, very busy mind. Now, there's a particular path where they try and move past the I thought, where, you know, if you think I, that is the I thought, and that is a form of identity. And they have, you know, meditation practices and koans and various ways of trying to see past the I thought and to see that it's not real. The I thought itself actually is not the root of the ego. The ego is rooted more in the heart, in this this sense of I, this feeling of I, and the I thought is a sort of a reflection of the I sense. If you basic awakening basically means that that I sense drops away, and you can still have an I thought after the I sense goes away, but it's empty. It's there, but it doesn't refer to a fully functioning ego anymore. It's just kind of running on inertia. And you can eventually awaken that I thought as well. But in this particular path, what they do is they actually go after the I thought, because that is something that is much more tangible than an I sense. I don't know how conscious they are of why they, why that's the path that works for them. But looking at it from the outside, that's what it looks like to me. There is the thought of I, which is very natural and tangible and refers to something. And if you can get the thought of I to awaken, then the I sense will go with it. So you can lose the I sense without losing the I thought, but you can't lose the I thought and not also lose the I sense. So that's one path of awakening, is to really inquire into the I thought. When you think I, that thought there, is that something real, or is that fake? Is there some subterfuge there? Is that pointing to something that isn't real? And if you can sort of see through the veil of the I thought, then it'll take the core veil with the I sense with it. Now, this is similar to what you can do in terms of inquiry. That's another very common path to awakening. And that's where you just really inquire, who am I? What am I? What is the truth of my existence or my being? And we all already know the truth. It's buried deep, deep inside for most of us. So we don't consciously know the truth. But just like in a dream, there's a part of you that always kind of knows that you're in a dream. While you're in it, you're convinced that it's all real and you're interacting with the dream as if it's real. But the reason why we can awaken in the morning and know that we were dreaming, no matter how real it felt in the moment, it's because part of us knows while we're dreaming that we're dreaming. It has a different kind of quality to it than reality. And it's similar with our true nature. Even in the depths of the dream, in the depths of human suffering, in the depths of separation and disconnect, something somewhere deep, deep down inside there knows the truth of its existence. Divinity always knows what it is. It can't not know fully. And so when you go into inquiry, when you start asking the question, who am I? That will first lead you typically to that I sense in the heart, whether you feel it there or not, but there will be a sense of I'm me, I'm Nathan, or I'm whatever, and you'll elicit that I sense. And then from there, you can keep dropping in. Well, am I really that? Who am I? Am I that? Seems like I am, but maybe not. Let's keep inquiring. And so you inquire further and further, not accepting any of the lies that, the illusion of the ego will keep saying, I'm me, I'm I, here we are, this is great, right? And that's a beautiful story, but no, I don't believe you. And so you keep inquiring and you inquire until you get the answer that's real. And that happens, whenever it happens. It can take, quite some time. But when it does happen, then something in you knows that you have reached a deeper truth of who you are. And I told this story in a previous talk, but I'll just briefly go over it again. When I had my awakening experience, the way that I knew that it was real was that I went back to that self-inquiry. I'd been asking that question, who am I? To try and force awakening to happen because I really wanted to awaken. And it was like, how many times do I have to ask this question? I don't know the answer, but every time I ask it, it's one less. And so that was my process. And so then when it seemed that I had awakened, or something had awakened, I went back and inquired again, who am I? And there was just emptiness and laughter. And that sense of I that had always, sort of arisen in response to the question wasn't there anymore. It had just gone away. So inquiry can be a very powerful path to awakening, because you're basically taking where you are, here at the surface of your consciousness and awareness. And then there's, that little point at the very center of your being that always knows what it is. And that inquiry of who am I is just trying to, create a connection between the two. It's creating kind of a tunnel through all this I sense, down, 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 until you get to divinity, and then the whole thing blows up. So there's meditation, there's seeing through the I thought, there's inquiry, and then there's what they call in Buddhism satsang. And that is where you spend time with somebody who is in an awakened state. And that could either be, a regular human being like you and I, who went through this whole process of separation and then woke up out of it. Or it could be, one of a handful of beings on the planet who never went through that process, just kind of incarnated directly in wholeness, which in Hinduism, they call such people avatars. And, I remember one time I went to visit Amachi, who I would say is an avatar. And I was hanging out with a friend of mine who had, just had her awakening experience. Her core veil dropped. And it was very pleasant hanging out with her, because she had awakened that sort of division, that fissure in human consciousness that most people have, wasn't there. There was just this sense of pleasant wholeness. And so I just kind of, sit next to her and spend a little bit of time with her, just kind of trying to not quite steal her awakening, but borrow it or copy it, because I really wanted to awaken. And so that felt pleasant. But then I would sort of turn my attention over to Amma, and she was just like the sun. And I looked over at my friend. I was like, oh, like, you're great and all, but you're like a 60-watt light bulb. And if I look over at Amma, she's not even our sun, but like, some gigantic sun. I don't know the technical term, but there's much bigger suns than ours. And she would be even bigger than that in terms of the awakeness, the divinity that she embodies. And so spending time with either an avatar or with an awakened being, there's a transmission that comes through that. We're always transmitting our consciousness to each other as we talk, as we spend time with each other, as we have our emotional reactions to things. We're always broadcasting our consciousness on one level or another. And so if you spend time with somebody who is awake, and particularly somebody who is deeply embodied in their awakening, or who is one of these, special types of people, the avatars, that gives your consciousness a couple of things. One, that direct transmission that's basically bringing the consciousness of wholeness into the parts of you that are still in separation. And it gives you a point of reference. It gives you something to look at and to try and emulate and trying to align yourself with. Now, some teachers are better at bridging awakeness than others. Some might be deeply, deeply awake, but they have no way of bridging that to other people. So others, so they might have students and they're all like struggling to try and sort of align with where the teacher is at. And if they're not very good at bridging, if they're not good at sort of showing on a consciousness level what's happening, and broadcasting that for others to receive, it won't work as well as somebody who is, particularly good at bridging. So I can give a couple of examples here. Like Tony Parsons, I would say, is deeply awake. He is a Neo-Advaita teacher in England, and I absolutely detest everything that he says. Like, he is so annoying. I don't believe in his philosophy. I don't believe in what he says as far as what awakening, much of anything about, sort of the framework that he puts around awakening. So on an intellectual level, on a framework level, I'm not aligned with him, but his awakeness is so deep and so powerful that I could just go either to one of his meetings or even listen to a recording of him talking. And if I ignored his words and didn't let myself get into a drama about it and just received, just listened and put myself into a receptive state, I could feel his awakeness coming through. And it would put me to sleep. Like, it was so intense, I would actually physically fall asleep because it was pushing up against all these places that were still deeply unconscious in me. And so then as that awake consciousness sort of bumps up against the unconscious, it lights up the unconscious. And what happens when you're unconscious? You go to sleep. So I kept falling asleep every time I would listen to him. Or not listen to him, but hear him and ignore everything that he had to say. But that worked, that helped. That was part of the process that helped me in my journey. And then another teacher that I find to be deeply awake is Adyashanti. And I would go to his satsangs quite regularly for a number of years. It was really amazing how every time I'd go, whatever he talked about would have some special relevance and significance to my life at that time. And anytime anybody that I went with, if we went in a group, we all had that same experience, maybe on different things that he said, but we all had, that experience of like, wow, he was really singing to me, like speaking to me, my experience really personally. And I did have the opportunity one time to speak to him directly, and in the question and answer session. And I was being a little bit cute with him. I had already lost my core veil, so I was feeling like I was hot shit. I had some, spiritual ego around that. And I went up and started talking. I didn't even have a question for him. I just told him, look, I actually don't have a question. I, just wanted to, come up and talk to you. And every time I think I have a question, my brain just says, well, this is what Adyashanti would say. I have a little Adyashanti in my head that would tell me what you were going to say. And in that moment, he did this really beautiful thing where he just kind of locked eyes with me, and I could feel this bridging of awake consciousness. He was just drilling it right into the center of my brain. And he said, throw away that little Adya. I am but a doormat for you to walk across into the sea of awakening. And that just kind of, it shut me up. We'll put it that way. And the depth of awakening that he was in was really remarkable, especially given that I had my own awakening experience. I was living in a state of awakeness to some degree, but he was much more embodied than I was, and I found it very helpful to spend time with him, even though I didn't have a core veil. He had been awake much longer and had a much deeper, richer embodiment of it. And so that direct transmission of consciousness turned out to be helpful for me, even though supposedly I might not have needed it, but I did. Spiritual ego is a son of a gun, I gotta tell you. So satsang, sitting with an awakened teacher, can be very, very helpful. There's another path that I'm not as familiar with. It isn't one that particularly resonated for me, but there is the path of devotion. There's a path of being devoted to divinity in some capacity, whether that is a guru or a teacher or an avatar. It could also be to Christ, who is an expression of divinity. Or some other god or goddess in the cosmos. You could even become a devotee of Kali. And Kali is scary but powerful and loving, and if you devote yourself to a being like that, then there's a way in which you are inviting their divine consciousness into you, into your separation consciousness. And so with that devotion, as you devote yourself to that being, it creates this relationship that facilitates that bridging. You're basically, instead of going to, say, an awake teacher and sitting there with them, and they're building a bridge to you, and you're kind of trying to, align with them, devotion actually builds a bridge that divine consciousness can walk across and come to you and really move things for you, and fill your separation consciousness with a consciousness of wholeness, or awake consciousness. So devotion and repeating the name of a divine being is a really powerful way to go. I actually, as a side note here, I have a cat, and I named her Lakshmi because every time I see her, or I'm mad at her, or I'm calling to her, I'm saying the name Lakshmi, which is the name of a Hindu goddess. And so I figured if I named my cat Lakshmi, then that would be a way of just always creating that bridge with divinity, even when I'm not thinking about it. So, by hook or by crook, whatever it takes. Now, I want to come back to Tony Parsons and the Neo-Advaita path, and that's his path. It's it's also called the path of non-duality, or the non-dual path. And this is a path that can be very powerful and very, very fast if you're ready for it. If you're already sort of close enough to awakening, it can really cut through a lot of BS that the ego is still kind of hanging out in. So the idea with the Neo-Advaita approach is they basically demolish any story that the ego might have. So, there is no process, there is no movement towards awakening, there's nothing you can do to awaken, everything's just an appearance, there's no cause and effect, everything's just kind of arising in this moment. And you just kind of keep saying that to yourself, and keep going to teachers who will tell that to you over and over and over again, who will say, there's nothing you can do to awaken. I don't know why you're here. You paid me money to come sit with me, and I don't get it, because there's nothing you can do and I can't help you. And that is a path to awakening. The caveat to that is, at least to my perception, they would probably disagree with me, but if you're not ready for it, if you're not, and they say this is only for the chosen few, for some people this is great, for everybody else, it's not for you. They won't tell you which one you are, so you'll keep showing up to their meetings. But they do acknowledge that, for some people, they come to Neo-Advaita and very quickly they awaken. Other people, they'll get there and they'll get stuck, because what happens is that then this whole thing of like, everything's an appearance, nothing is real, there's nothing you can do, that just becomes the ego story. The ego just kind of takes that and says, oh, okay, there's nothing I can do, so I'll just, go to a bar and shoot up some heroin. Like, what's the difference, And the thing is that there is a difference. If you are in that sort of range where hearing this is going to just obliterate the ego story, well, that's great. That'll work for you, and then you can, enjoy your awakening. But if you're not in that range, then the idea that there's nothing you can do to awaken will sound like, well, then I might as well just, do whatever my ego wants to do, because it doesn't matter. I'll either awaken or I won't. And so then you wind up doing all the things that will actually make it more difficult to awaken. So there's a little bit of a trap there. You don't want to hang out too much in the Neo-Advaita path. If it doesn't, result in a shift in consciousness, if you don't actually awaken through Neo-Advaita within a period of time, I don't know what it is. I wouldn't give it more than 3 months. If it doesn't happen in that time, and you're not still feeling that inner calling to it, then I would say, find another path, because otherwise you're just going to get stuck in this kind of mental place of denying all realities and all process, and just hanging out in the unawake state, uh, you know, until something breaks. So yeah, just be careful. Now, finally, there are many other paths, but the last main one that I want to talk about tonight has to do with the healing modality that I started taking classes in back in 2002. It's called Vortex Healing. It sounds, I mean, just the name itself was enough to make me not want to study it for a whole year. The first time I heard it, I was like, oh, wow, that sounds like so intense and like weirdly so. Like, what are you trying to prove, So I wasn't particularly interested in it, even as a healing modality. But, a year later, it kind of showed up in my life again. And as a principled skeptic, I was willing to be proven wrong. I thought it was hokey and couldn't possibly be a thing, but I'm willing to be proven wrong. And so I wound up receiving a session from one of my friends, and it was really mind-blowing. It really just cut through so much of the emotional burden I'd been carrying for my entire life, really, but especially in that moment. And then what shifted after the sense of relief fell away, there was still a permanent shift where I had always been sort of in the background of my consciousness, looking for a reason to doubt myself, and this really deep issue around self-doubt. And after this one session, that self-doubt, or that aspect of self-doubt, was gone and gone forever. It never came back. And we never even talked about it. It's not like this person put the suggestion in my mind that I was going to have a shift around self-doubt. We didn't even talk about the issue that that was going to be worked on. It was just, this energy flowed and it did something, and hopefully that helped. And it turned out that that's what it did. And as I continued to take classes, it became clear that this was a path of awakening. The way that it works is that it works by these transmissions that bridge divine consciousness through the teacher into the student, and then from the student, who might be a practitioner, into themselves or into others. And that bridging is constantly taking away the separation consciousness that drives the I sense, that keeps filling it with grist, you could say. And so it just kept releasing more and more of that separation consciousness. And as those things dissolved, you start realizing, well, wait a minute, I thought that I was somebody who doubted himself. I thought I was the self-doubt, but I'm not. Oh, okay, but I'm still here. Something's still here. And then I thought I was this anger, but now the anger is gone. So I guess I wasn't that either. Something's still here, but it's not that. And so with each issue, with each pattern of consciousness that gets released, that you had been identified with, you recognize more and more and more, oh, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, because that can go away and you're still here. So what is it that's still here? What am I really if I'm not all those things? And so it turned out to be a very, very helpful process. Just that alone can do a lot to move a person towards awakening. And one of the specialties of vortex healing is in releasing karma knots, those points of separation consciousness that rest along the center of the spine. And all those have to be gone before you can start to move towards releasing the core veil. And you can release, with the tools of vortex healing, you can release a karma knot in anywhere from 10 minutes to maybe 10 or 30 seconds. I mean, it goes really, really rapidly. And so you can just release them one by one by one. And that's what we do in the awakening acceleration meditation at the beginning. If somebody still has karma knots, then that's the first thing that I'm going to do, is I'm going to use that time to release as many karma knots as possible in each sitting. Typically, it would be just one per sitting, but sometimes you can get two to pop off as well. So there's this modality that can bridge divine consciousness deep into these places where we're held in separation. And over time, the founder, Rick Weinman, who I would still consider one of my teachers, he found a way to sort of push people over the edge. We were using all these tools to release karma knots and to move through these energetic shifts in consciousness. And eventually he got to the point where he could take large groups of people through that whole process and eventually to releasing the core veil. So if you have a high tolerance for woo, for weird new age stuff that works, then that's a path that I would recommend. But it's not for everybody. It's something that just like with any path of awakening, it has to resonate for you. And if it does, great. I highly recommend it. And if not, then there's lots of other paths to awakening that I would suggest. And it mostly comes down to what you yourself feel called to do. So that's the last of the sort of primary paths that I wanted to go through. As I said, every person has their own path, and sometimes it's just the one path that works for you, and you don't need multiple things going on. But a lot of people like to kind of explore different things, get what they can from one teacher or one modality, and get what they can from another as well. And I just encourage you to experiment and explore and find what works for you, and just follow that calling. If you have an authentic calling to awakening, just keep following it wherever it takes you, and really surrender to the path that unfolds through that. Even if it takes you down some dark alleys, use your discernment and develop a sense of when it's your ego that's driving you down a dark alley versus when there's just a truly deep calling pulling you there. And once you have that discernment, then just trust it and keep surrendering to it and keep moving along the path until you have that moment where that core veil just dissolves back into nothingness, and who you really are and what you really are becomes where you live from. And then just keep dropping deeper in from there. So that's my talk. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions or comments or anything you want to share about your experience or anything that I said, by all means. So Jason, yes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What, from your opinion or understanding, at what point does enough awakeness happen that a person would no longer be reincarnating, or at least incarnating onto the next, whatever is beyond human?
Right. So yeah, in Buddhism, there's this, and Hinduism, there's this idea that when you awaken, you sort of step off the wheel of reincarnation. And my understanding of that is that it's not synonymous with basic awakening. Like when the core veil goes, you could still reincarnate after that. There's a separate energetic body that sort of makes us earthbound in a sense. You can call it the incarnational body. And I remember when I first tuned into it, there was just this sense of heaviness, and it just wanted to pull me into the center of the earth. And then once it popped, it was really clear that something fundamental had shifted. And if I was to incarnate again, it would come from a place of freedom and service, rather than the need to keep playing out the wheel of reincarnation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're very welcome. Anybody else have any thoughts, questions, jokes, anything you'd like to share? Anne, yes.
So I think I have a call to awaken, but I'm really not sure if it's my ego.
Hmm.
I mean, how do I learn to have that kind of discernment? Yeah, I mean, I think one of
Hmm.
my core issues is a lack of self-confidence, or maybe whatever, lack of
Right.
belief in myself. So there's that.
Gotcha. Um, it's going to be different for everybody because our egos are so tricky, and we'll try and mask its agenda with something flowery and beautiful, and like, oh no, it's a calling. Don't look behind the curtain. I'm not there. It's a true calling from divinity, and so ultimately that will be your own process to go through. Um, but I think ultimately, if I tune into that, it's like if it's coming from the ego, there's going to be something that the ego wants to get out of the experience. The ego wants to escape its suffering. It wants to be seen, by others as being great or special or something like that. And so it might want the status that it thinks it could get from people thinking that you're awake. So if it's coming from the ego and only coming from the ego, uh, there's going to be some agenda behind it, and you have to really be honest with yourself. Is there an agenda behind this? And of course, the ego, if there is a true calling, the ego is going to project its agenda onto that. But if at the core of it there is a true calling, then there will be a willingness to go into awakening no matter what. Even if you would lose all the things that the ego is trying to get out of its experience. It's like, well, God, that would suck, but all right, I'm down. If you have that level of surrender, if you have that level of commitment to discovering the truth of who and what you are, and that doesn't itself become the strategy of the ego. Anything that I say, the ego is going to say, okay, I'm going to do that. I'll do whatever Nathan says or whatever this teacher says that indicates a true calling. So you have to watch out for how the ego is going to try and take things over. But if in that sort of deep and authentic inquiry, you can find a place that just wants the truth, just wants something deeper, and doesn't care about sort of the trappings and the escape and the status and the this and the that, all that might be nice, but ultimately I'm in it for this other thing, which is just to, uh, live as what I really am, to live as within the truth of what I am. If that's there, regardless of all the agendas, then I would say that's an authentic calling. But because the ego is so tricky, there is no one size fit all answer to that question. You just have to kind of see through the ego's games and then see if there is something in there that is really actually authentically dedicated to stepping into awakening regardless of the cost. That's why you have these stories of people who awaken through these sort of heroic acts of surrender. They jump off a building, or they set themselves on fire, or they give away all of their wealth. Whatever it is that they were attached to or afraid of, they'll just go ahead and confront it head on, because it's more important to them to awaken than it is to hold on to that sort of material object or situation or what have you. So it's a little tricky, but just keep developing your discernment around it, and eventually you'll come to the true answer.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Good.
A side question.
Yes.
The other day you mentioned that you knew somebody that awakened and basically spent 3 months in bed.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you, I mean,
Are you worried about that?
I am. I
Okay.
mean, I'm worried about something like that because, like, who's going to take care of all my dogs? I mean, I have these like practical questions, like,
Right.
wait
Well,
a minute, so, or am I going to lose my connection to my children and things like that?
Right. Well, fortunately, for you, not for her, but fortunately for you, because I know you're on the Vortex Healing path. The lineage just has so much more awakeness in it now than it did when she awakened, and there's just a lot more support for being able to go through these very revolutionary shifts and still be able to function. So within, if you keep sort of working with Vortex Healing and with what I bring from that lineage as well, there is sort of a built-in safety net around that. Now, that being said, there are no guarantees. And every once in a while, there are people who awaken through this path where it can be quite rocky for them. And it's pretty severe to only to be stuck in bed for 3 months. I think part of the reason why that happened for her is because honestly she had the privilege to be able to do that. She was actually quite wealthy, so she could afford to just sit in bed for 3 months. Whereas for you or for anybody else who has more kind of worldly concerns, there's enough sort of love within the divinity that is bringing you to awakening to recognize what your needs are and to not have the same thing happen to you that would happen to somebody else who would be able to everybody's situation is different, and she could handle that and her life could support that, whereas yours couldn't. And so I imagine the divine would find a different way to bring you into awakeness.
Thank you. That's very reassuring.
I live to serve.
Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Anybody else have any questions or anything they wanted to share from today's talk and meditation? Yes, Jason.
Yeah, I just kind of want to hear a bit more about like tuning into the incarnational body and that you're talking about.
Right.
I mean, I'm on the Vortex Healing path.
Sure. I would say if you're, it's experiential. I don't have any more words to describe it. So I would just say, for yourself, just do the mantra that we get in Vortex Healing into the incarnational body to light up awareness there and see what that feels like to you.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All righty. Looks like we're doing great on time. Yes, Naeem.
What's the name of that English awakened master that you said you don't agree with his views, but you still feel the benefits of his satsang presence? What was his name? I missed it.
Sure. His name is Tony Parsons.
Tony, I've never heard of him. Thank you. Okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yep. He's a British guy, lives in England. I forget exactly what his story is, but it was, awakening just kind of happened for him. He didn't, go and, do a lot of sitting and meditation and seeking out gurus and whatnot. It was more spontaneous for him. And so I think for him, because that was his experience, he just thinks of it as something that either happens or doesn't. But from my perspective, I would imagine that in his previous incarnations, he probably got really close to awakening and didn't quite cross the threshold. And so then in this incarnation, it just didn't take very much. And it happened in what seemed like a spontaneous moment. And yet there was actually, probably many, many years, if not eons, of process that happened before that. And before he was, he can remember in this body, all that happened, outside of his memory. And so for him, it just, is a thing that randomly happens, and either you get it or you don't. But for me, there is a process, and you can either align with that process or not. Okay. Give people another moment or two to decide if they have a question. Yes, Emily.
I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of Anne. Actually, I really appreciated your question about what awakening looks like and if your ego is driving it. I wanted to share that a couple of years ago, I was in a relationship where I was very well off financially, and something just didn't feel quite right. It felt like something was calling me to do more. And I thought along the way, a lot of the time, that maybe I was just being driven by my ego to get whatever it was I needed out of the situation. But after a couple of years, I finally gave up my financial standing with this partner and basically had to start over from scratch. And now that I'm at this point, I'm on the Vortex Healing path as well. A lot of things have shifted and changed. And I've found that because I listened to that voice that came up and was, driving me internally to awaken and to work through my stuff, I found that if I wouldn't have listened to it and heard what I was saying, that I wouldn't be where I'm at right now. So I wanted to encourage you to really hear whatever it is that's going on internally for you, and listen to, what you're calling, what your path is. That's
Thank you,
it.
Emily.
Yeah.
Now I have, I'm going to get to you, Carrie, in just a moment here, but I have somebody's asking a question about Jesus and his path and how he sort of went straight to the source. So, what was his tool? And for me, I would say that Jesus was and is one of these avatars that I was talking about earlier, where there's this being that incarnates in human form, but comes to that form directly from source without having gone through the whole process of separation and ego and having to wake up out of it. He had kind of a special path where his avatar nature, he'd kind of shielded from himself so that he could have the human experience and to really live as a human and to bridge divine love through the human body and through the human form and human consciousness as service to humanity, so that all of us could sort of follow in that path. So he had his 40 days and nights in the desert, and that's when sort of this artificial veil dropped away, and he came to recognize his divinity in a particular way. And from the outside, that might look like he had an awakening experience like you or I might have. But to my perception, and obviously everybody's free to disagree with me, but to my perception, it was just a different kind of awakening back into his avatar nature, or his perfectly divine nature without separation, which is a very different process. We can't really compare that to what we as regular karmic human beings go through. So I hope that answers your question. And Carrie, go ahead.
Regarding what Anne had to say about how the awakening path, I'm struggling quite a bit with, I have a mainstream job, a very mainstream job that I've had for decades. And all the while, a part of me was like, no, this isn't it. This isn't it,
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm on the Vortex path, and I'm thinking, well, how the hell, I just don't see, I'm just afraid of, I'm not afraid of awakening. I want that very much, but it's like, how do I survive financially? How do I transition from this, do I even want to run, have a practice? I signed up for the practice course on Friday, but, and then all the questions they ask are like, I'm sorry this is a long question, and it's personal, but I really, you've been doing it for 18 years. and you obviously have been a practitioner for a lot of that time. But I mean, it's like to go from this totally mainstream job that supports me into like, oh, am I going to have a vortex healing practice? Or, you know,
Right.
it's not that easy. There's a lot of fear there about how am I going to survive, you know, once my core veil is, you know, am I going to be able to earn a living this way, or do I even want to earn a living this way? I mean, how to make it all work? I just have no clue.
Right.
I'm really in fear right now.
Right. Well, I would say a couple of things. One is, you know, don't put the cart before the horse. You know, just be present. Right now, you have a job that supports you and that works for you. That you know, however difficult it is to, you know, mesh that with uh, your spiritual practice. If that is fulfilling a need for you, then stick with it, you know, and don't feel like you're don't get too ahead in the story. You know, we have no idea what the future is, and so we tend to project our fears, our worst fears, onto the mystery of the future. But the fact is that the future is mysterious, and that means it could be anything. It could be something far better than anything you could imagine right now. So rather than project your worst fears onto it and then live in that projection, just allow yourself to be in the mystery of it. And then the second part would be to trust. You know, part of this whole process, whether it's an awakening path or just personal growth, is learning to trust the process, learning to trust life, learning to trust yourself. And the more that you can do that, the easier it becomes. And then you don't have as many worries about what's going to happen. I had no idea when I started my practice whether it was going to be successful or not. I you know, left a stable job. It wasn't easy making a living doing something that nobody had ever heard of before, but it was right for me. And so I just trusted that. And as it turned out, that trust was not misplaced. You know, life, you know, unfolded exactly as it needed to. And so then I was able to develop a practice out of that. But not everybody is. You know, that might not be your path at all. It could be that, you know, you go through all this awakening stuff and you get to a place of freedom. And from that place of freedom, you recognize that the job you have isn't right for you, but neither is starting a healing practice. And so then something else opens up. You know, if you're in alignment with the truth of who you are, that truth will take you to where you need to be. And it might be hard to really see that or accept that or trust that right now, but just know that you will get there. You'll get to the place where the truth of who you are is as informative as it needs to be of what you need to do and where you need to go. And until you're there, just keep doing what you're doing now. Your job is serving you, so stick with your job and don't worry about what comes next.
Thank you. That was very helpful, extremely helpful. Thank
Good.
you.
Good.
Yeah, Nathan, I have a quick question, not a quick question, but something I want to ask you if this is within the scope of our program that we are doing together every month or every week. So you don't have to answer it fully this right now, but I just wanted to see if it's within the scope of our. Can I go ahead?
Go for it.
So a lot of spiritual and mystics have also pointed to the presence of hostile forces on the planet or within the human realm that obstruct and frustrate the human impulse towards divinity or aspirations towards higher forms of consciousness or in action or in thought. And I noticed that Rick doesn't dwell on that too much, and he kind of uh, gives it attention but not emphasis. So, what are your thoughts about that? And in some ways, is it something that in the future sessions I can ask more details about it, or is that something that you can there'll be a discourse on it?
I'm probably not going to get into that too much. I don't feel that any of those forces, I don't know what they are. I don't have a lot of familiarity with them, so I wouldn't want to talk about something that I, have no clue about. And secondly, whatever forces there are, I haven't encountered any myself that could actually impede a person's process. If anything, they would just be a part of that person's process, because those forces are divinity as well. And so if they are interacting with you in your life and you have that authentic calling to awakening, then they will be part of that process of awakening. And if that comes up in specific ways, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not going to focus on it too much.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sure. Okay, and last one, because we're just about out of time. Irina?
Hi, everybody. I just want to answer her question because I know the person who was 2 years totally out of money, then invested all up to the last dollar into 1 year of taking all courses straight from basic to Corvail. And then when she was out of all money, divinity provide her dream, unlimited money support until the last class, the top class of Vortex Healing.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can predict it. Nobody can enjoy it more than she did. So that was truth.
Mm-hmm.
Just believe.
Beautiful, thank you.
Divinity will find the ways.
And I'll speak to that actually a bit more. I think it's on March 3rd. There will be a talk on manifesting. And there I'll get into my process. I went and did all these courses because I felt such a deep calling to do vortex healing. And I wound up getting, long story short, about $70,000 in debt, and with no reasonable way of paying it all off. But intuitively, as much as I thought I should just declare bankruptcy, it felt to me like that was not my path and not what I was supposed to do. And as I continued to deepen in my own awakening process and to deal with my issues, eventually I was able to turn it all around and pay off all the debt and get, I went from $70,000 in debt to $70,000 in the bank, and I was able to buy a house. So there, divinity has a way, and we don't always know what it is in the beginning, and we might be scared of it if we did.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's actually, they're serving us all the time in the background, whether we know it or not, and whether we can trust it or not. And I found that because the worrying about it creates a lot of anxiety and suffering for me, I just stopped worried. I just don't worry about it, and I trust, and that trust tends to be well placed. So with that, because we are out of time, I'm going to let everybody go. A few people had to leave already anyway. So thank you all once again for coming. I appreciate your joining us. I appreciate your taking the time for yourself and to learn and grow and to develop within your own path and your own process. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Nathan. See you soon.
Yes. See y'all soon.